Okay, looks like the video is good. All right, greetings. I'm Joseph Nicolello, English department at Fordham University, and I'm going to be working today with Rafa on this video, whereas we're going to be talking about Inferno 14, the role of classical literature within it, a layout of the canto itself, and then we're actually going to look at, on my part, a synthesis of how all of this works into a contemporary work of prose poetry or a novel or contemporary epic, however we want to put it, a work that I've recently completed. So we're going to be looking at the classics in Dante, and then Dante and the classics in a contemporary work. So we have this synthesis planned, and with that, I will just turn it right over to Rafa to begin.
Great, thanks, Joseph. Yeah, my name is Rafael Torre de Silva. I'm an undergraduate student at New York University, and I am majoring in classics. I've always been amazed by Dante's rewriting of the classical tradition, how he's able to turn everything upside down in his head by changing the tone and redirecting the themes. And this is precisely why I've chosen to work with Joseph on Canto 14 of the Inferno, because it is packed with classical references and rhetorical style. It is a canto that not only challenges the reader, but also tries to convey an idea about classical thought. Thus, we can distinguish two main ideas in this canto, which actually work in two different spheres: its structure and its content. First, regarding its structure, the fact that it is full of classical references helps Dante build a thesis which argues for the importance of classical thinking. He presents the synthesis of human truth and Christian faith, and the latter reconciles and elevates the former to the divine realm of revelation. But not only does Dante praise the classical truths, but he also corrects them. He presents the value of both worlds and then defends the predominance of Christian doctrine. Second, regarding its content, the main thesis of the canto is that hell is oneself. Our sins, for which we are responsible, become our own punishment. Dante presents a world of responsibility, of self-inflicted unhappiness. We can therefore see how these two ideas are particularly relevant for here and now. First, in terms of classical thought, we find ourselves in a world of revisionism, where, driven by ignorance, some sectors of society are trying to ban the classics from education, but they don't realize that these works are not frozen objects to be contemplated in a museum. They are alive. And they contain lessons for today. From the perspective of history, of course, we cannot forget where we come from. These classical texts are truly the basis of our civilization. And from a moral perspective, these works contain clear and immutable truths of our human nature, which, by their own definition, they are already useful for us. Second, in terms of hell being oneself, we also find ourselves in a world of external blame, so to speak. We complain about other people's faults, and we oftentimes neglect to examine ourselves. Thus, Dante is trying to convey these two lessons from both the content and the structure of Canto 14. Now, diving into the very narration of the canto, we find ourselves in the seventh circle, that of violence, on the third ring, violence against God, and on the first of the three categories of the sinners, the ones that committed violence against God himself. That is, the blasphemers and the deniers of God. These ones are lying supine on the ground, and if you think about it, this is the perfect position for the complete humiliation they deserve. Those who dare to stand up and raise their fists against heavens, they are now lying on the dirt. And we already see a similar image to that of the Tower of Babel in the Bible, where they tried to reach the heavens through their proud and arrogant height, and they were brought down to the ground. And the same happens to the blasphemers. We also find an interesting verse in verse 6 of the canto where it says, dreadful art of justice. And exactly because justice is actually an art, and God is the creator of everything. And the landscape here is an arid desert because they deny God. So God cannot create anything beautiful there. So it is just an empty, arid plain with no life, no greenness, just raw sand. Because they deny God, so there is no place for his art, only for the art of his justice, not of his creation. We can see, as in the rest of the Commedia, how the geography of the place is actually a metaphorical description of the sin. And if you also think about it, why is actually sand, this sand in the desert? Well, sand is little pieces of rocks that were once great and now they're broken into pieces. And that's exactly what happens to the sinners. that they were once proud and now they're destroyed. Then we also find a reference to Cato the Younger from Lucan's Pharsalia, Book 9, and he makes the case, Dante, that this is a similar sand to that which Cato walked upon his way to the battle against Julius Caesar. And again, he could have used any other reference from the Bible to describe the desert, but no, he used Cato. And this is very interesting because Cato, in fact, represents a virtuous pagan. He's the hero of the poem in Lucan. He's the only laudable man in the midst of flawed and unattractive characters and terrible actions of sacrilege and insanity of civil war. But he, Cato, remains faithful to his ideals. He's virtuous. In fact, even though he committed suicide, in the Commedia, Cato is placed in purgatory. So did Dante admire this Roman Stoic. And then again, there is another classical reference, which is the flakes of fire from the fall and the sinners. And this is from a letter that apparently, well, supposedly Alexander the Great wrote to his tutor Aristotle. And this fire falls from heaven onto the Sodomites and the blasphemers. And it obviously reminds the reader of Genesis 19, where God brought down fire onto the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. But here, no. Here, instead of mentioning the passage from the Bible, Dante chooses a classical reference, which is very interesting because, again, through the structure of the canto, he's trying to reinforce his message about the importance of classical thought. Then we arrive at the topic of blasphemy, leaving behind the theme of the landscape. Now we start focusing on the very sin of the canto. And once again, this is blasphemy against the Christian God, but Dante uses a classical reference. He chooses the Theban cycle, which becomes for him the lens through which he focuses on blasphemy. He treats blasphemy against Zeus or Jove, a pagan god, as equivalent to the blasphemy against the Christian deity. He doesn't choose Christian politicians of his time, which would have been incredibly easy, of course, for him. But no, he chooses mythology. And the question would be, why? Why does he choose mythology? And again, if you think about it, in my opinion, mythology becomes this kind of a universal set of rules, these atemporal compilation of principles, just as the natural law. And he's making the case that blasphemy is a sin against natural law, not that much against the concrete revealed truth by the faith, a concrete message from God, but it is actually against our own nature. And that is why mythology, it is also a sin. Even in a world of pagans, it is a sin to compare yourself to a god, which in fact proves the point I was making earlier, that the pagan classics contain innate truths about humanity. We see already how Dante is starting to build a contrast between pagan sinners and pagan heroes. And we've already seen the hero, Cato, and now we'll see the sinner, Capaneus. But before that, there's a very interesting scene where Dante corrects Virgil. He addresses him with almost an insult. And he says in verse 43 to 45, "Master, you who can defeat all things except for those tenacious demons who try to block us at the entryway." And this is actually a reference to Canto 8 and 9 of the Inferno. And Dante is presenting the limitations of the pagans. Yes, you can be virtuous, you can avoid punishment, you can be in limbo or purgatory, but a noble pagan is not the same as a saint. And this is a very important idea leading to Capaneus, to the main character of the canto, because Capaneus is definitely not a virtuous pagan. So we can find virtuous pagans and sinful pagans, but still they're pagans. So he makes this distinction that yeah, you can be virtuous according to natural law, but still Christian faith is above classical thought. Now, Capaneus is this hero from Thebes that is first referenced in Aeschylus in 7 Against Thebes, but obviously Dante only took it from Statius Thebaid because he could only read Latin. And we find a hero that has been reduced, so to speak, from his heroic proportions in the classical texts. He's no longer charismatic or sympathetic. And we can again ask ourselves why. Because in other cantos, Dante actually presents many sinners as charismatic and lovable, but here he doesn't. And I think here he doesn't even, it's because he doesn't even want you to think that you can feel identified with the sinner. He wants to make clear that blasphemy is one of the worst sins. And you cannot even sympathize with the sinner because it is so bad that there's not even place for compassion. In fact, Capaneus is actually the second most arrogant soul in hell, according to Dante, as it appears in Inferno 25:13. He's actually behind Vanni Fuzzi. He's the first one. And not only is Capaneus a reference to the classics, but in his speech, he also displays high-toned classical rhetoric and quite complex syntax. And you would also expect the sinner, who kind of repents or is sad for his own sin, but no, he boasts about his very own fault. He's proud even after death. There's no repentance and therefore no forgiveness. He's not changed. And here we come to one of the most important verses of the canto, which is verse 51. The words of Capaneus. Qual io fui vivo, tal son morto. Just as I was living, so am I dead. Because indeed, hell is being eternally oneself. We are our own hell. This is no longer Sartre's famous dictum where he says, l'enfer c'est les autres, hell is other people. No, Dante's principle is built on personal responsibility. Hell is the extension of earthly realities, of our own earthly life. And that's why there's some in limbo and others down below, because you are your own hell, not because of God's external decision or punishment. And in fact, Capaneus, not even after death, has tempered his defiance. He boasts that he's unchanged, as if that lack of change were something to be proud of. In reality, as Virgil points out, his arrogance is his own punishment. Sin is not happiness, because God's decrees agree with human nature. If God forbids something, it's because it actually makes you unhappy. And that is what Virgil actually says in verse 63 to 66. O Capaneo, in cio che non s'ammorza la tua superbia, se tu più punito. Nullo martiro, fuor che la tua rabbia, sarebbe al tuo furor dolor compito. O Capaneus, for your arrogance that is not quenched, you're punished all the more. No torture other than your own madness could offer pain enough to match your wrath. I mean, this is a beautiful passage. And we see Virgil, a virtuous pagan, who's correcting a sinful pagan. He's saying, no, you don't get it. It is actually your very own arrogance that is making you unhappy, still down here. Then, leaving behind Capaneus, we reach the second part of the canto, which actually restates the moral lesson of the first half. And Capaneus's "We are our own hell" is restated in a slightly different way with this new image, that of the Veglio di Creta, the Old Man of Crete. This is a statue located in Mount Ida in the island of Crete, which was once, according to mythology, ruled by Saturn during the Golden Age when the world was chaste and good, according to verse 96. And this statue is located halfway between the east and the west, between Damietta in the Nile Delta in Egypt and Rome. That is, between the old civilizations and the modern cultures. It actually follows the trajectory of the sun. It goes from east to west, from audience to occidens, from birth to death, but not only the birth and the death of the sun, but the birth of these glorious civilizations and the death of the current decayed ones. The image of the statue is taken from the book of Daniel in the Bible, where the king Nebuchadnezzar asks the prophet for the interpretation of a certain dream he had. And the idea of the decadence of humankind through the ages, from golden age to silver, to bronze, iron, and then clay, is taken from Hesiod, the Greek author. But for Dante, it's taken from Ovid's Metamorphoses and Virgil's Aeneid. So again, we see this reconciliation between the Bible and the classical tradition, between human truths and Christian faith, that they are hand to hand, touching on the same moral truths. In fact, the pagan myth of the decadence of humanity corresponds or even resonates with the biblical Garden of Eden, that earthly paradise prior to the fall, those days when the world was good and chaste. In fact, in Dante, the tears that come out of the statue do not come out from his golden head, because that was a time without sin, that was a time without suffering. Then we arrive at the main idea of this image, which is that the tears that come out of the statue form the rivers of hell. The rivers of hell are made of tears. This obviously reminds us of a verse in Book 1 of the Aeneid, where the hero, Aeneas, says, Sunt lacrimae rerum, et mentem mortalia tangunt, which is literally translated, these are the tears for things, and mortal events touch the mind. And this happens when Aeneas is gazing at a wall in a Carthaginian temple that depicts battles from the Trojan War. He's looking at the deaths of his friends and companions. And this whole sentence, that there are tears for things and mortal things touch the mind, encapsulates the futility, the waste of human life. But the image of the tears in Dante has a very different tone from Virgil's. Virgil simply states it without any ethical context, while Dante chooses not to represent the melancholy, that is, the almost lack of sense and direction in human life, that of the futility, there are tears for things and nothing makes much sense here. Rather, Dante decides to capture the justice, the culpability, the responsibility in the moral failure of humans. He's inserting an ethical reading on the classics, which is actually how he Christianizes the classical thinking by providing a truth that is objective. And yes, the truths in the classical world are restated, are purified, and are confirmed by Christian faith. And this is precisely the concept of responsibility that Dante is trying to convey, the fact that our own tears, the tears of human history, make the rivers of hell, the rivers of our suffering. So our suffering becomes our own suffering. It is our sins that become our punishment. So hell is not imposed upon us from the outside, but it is our own creation. After this, we reach the end of the canto, where there's a short description of the rivers and the different paths through hell. And here Dante asks Virgil about one of the rivers, Lethe, the river of forgetfulness. And Dante questions Virgil so as to give him an opportunity to correct his own Aeneid. Because in his work, Virgil locates Lethe in hell, but now Dante is going to place it in purgatory. So Dante, the poet, is offering Virgil an opportunity to correct his own work. That is, a Christian writer is changing, redirecting, and correcting a classical author. I mean, this is the ultimate reaction. This is the ultimate Christianization of the classical thought. And thus, this wonderful canto, full of classical references, concludes with the correction of that great tradition that formed the very canto, with the correction of classical texts. And this is all I got so far. And with all this having been said, I turn it over to you, Joseph.
All right, wonderful. Thanks so much. And it is the spirit that charges precisely what you were just talking about, and the energy behind it that really went into the construction of my book and my scholarship that is currently developing, dealing with Dante, is along similar classical lines. I'll take a little bit to explain how all this works, but in terms of the novel for now. So the synthesis of the classical and contemporary, whereas Dante looks to Virgil, for me, in a sense, let's say, as an author or the protagonist of the book, might either or look to Dante in the same way that he would look to Virgil. And what we see in this first of the three parts is generally in a fictional town called Jerusalem, Pennsylvania. And it is, in 34 chapters that all mirror the Inferno. So when we get to what is the equivalent of Inferno 14 in my book, what we see is the protagonist and the love of his life, who, as William Fellows, is from something of a complicated religious background and a little bit lost in his own sense. And the love of his life is from, let's say, a family of blasphemers and idolaters. And he tries everything that he can in the scene that we're about to discuss to prepare himself for it and to work through it and to reimagine it with almost like the armor of various texts. But what he finds is that blasphemy has destroyed their minds. And it is, an arid desert of the soul in this scene. So as the pilgrim is ever precocious, he himself knows that in understanding himself and reality and the formulating structure of it at the earlier stages of the book, that he must go beyond Sartre as well. And in doing so, he looks to actually another 20th century English language work of literature called Under the Volcano by Malcolm Lowry, and has this passage on his mind as he approaches the family home of Helena Caravan, who is his love. Quote, "And this is how I sometimes think of myself, as a great explorer who has discovered some extraordinary land from which he can never return to give his knowledge to the world, but the name of this land is hell." So in addition to the setting of the canto that overlaps in subtle details throughout the descriptions of Jerusalem, Pennsylvania, the rings, river, flakes of fire, blasphemous dialogue transforming from, nature itself into aspects of the supernatural, although the book is not itself, I suppose, supernatural in any sense. There's no, well, you could read it and find out. But the entire motif of coming to meet these parent figures, this meeting of the pagans, if you will, is, he finds, predicated upon a predetermined judgment, that an aspect of the hell in this chapter of the book is the characters coming to realize that one being proven innocent, or one guilty until proven innocent. Although in hell, there's actually no chance to be proven innocent. A statement that encompasses this canto and our contemporary situation at large, whereby we see one is made a scapegoat, and even when and if proven innocent, is guilty of having been initially being declared guilty, despite the accusers potentially being wrong. It's this sort of stamp in its own way that has been fixed upon people, and that we find throughout Dante in his references to other canti and in other aspects of the Inferno, that sort of trickles into the stage that I set in this chapter. That through the characters, and William, we know at this point he's reading Homer, Horace, Macrobius, Ficino's Platonic theology, and the text of this volume, or first part of it, even begins with an invocation of pagan muses, which may be up for the reader and future scholars to decide, but that may or may not, again, be a nod to Dante and what he has to say, what Rafa was just brilliantly explicating for us, this aspect of the natural law, and then the Christian vision, this idea of a pagan who commits suicide, but is actually so noble that he's not condemned to hell, that it's actually a purgatorial thing. There are aspects of characters that pop up then in this chapter that we might see in the equivalent of purgatory, that we might think are left behind in hell. Generally, to the best of my ability, I've tried to do within a Dantean framework. So with traces of William's unfolding aesthetic and, let's say, ontological vision of life, his extreme unease with the caravan's family, it's an afternoon of extreme debauchery, extreme alcoholism, extreme profanity, harshly anti-Christian rhetoric. We find that William is actually pained by these things. And it causes us to take a step back and think, but I thought that, this 19-year-old that knows everything was beyond religion, that he, had figured it all out. Why then would he be pained by this? Well, I think that what we see is sometimes the idea of the thing is a little bit different from the reality of it. I think Dante and all of us Dante scholars know quite a bit about that. So alongside, as he learns about the family history in person, as it were, this can be read alongside Inferno 14 in the book. The personal histories of the families can actually be read with the canto. And, it's almost as though it's a disabling ring that is almost a, as Dante notes, the second and third rings early in the canto. For William, these rings that he recognizes are the realization and suffocating quarters that coincide to bring forth the nightmare, that everything that he has thought about this possibility of a future life with this girl has actually been a complete illusion. So to this end, we learn more autobiographical things about the character that, make more sense among the reading. But ultimately, for one frame of concrete reference, we can consider Inferno 14, lines 16 through 24. And I'll just do the English briefly for time. But O vengeance of the Lord, how you should be dreaded by everyone who now can read whatever was made manifest to me. I saw so many flocks of naked souls, all weeping miserably, and it seemed that they were ruled by different decrees. Some lay upon the ground, flat on their backs, some huddled in a crouch, and there they sat, and others moved about incessantly. In the loosest sense, this is precisely how the afternoon ends up. It begins with extreme arrogance, extreme anti-Christian rhetoric, extreme hatred, all of this, again, completely unfounded, as this is truly hell, and the propagators of this hell, just as the pagan cannot find an authentic enjoyment because he cannot comprehend the extremity of his egotism. The caravan family cannot comprehend how they can deliver themselves to hell by the very evening of first meeting the pilgrim. And him witnessing this is revelatory, to say the least. We read in we could say, translating 63 to 64, Dante, something that in English we might call an unquenched arrogance. For me, I took that and decided there could be an entire character who begins and ends with unquenched arrogance. I think that ties into themes of the digitality of our times, something beyond Orwell, beyond narcissism, and actually trying to construct characters modeled on observations of Dante. I think that once again, these things can be enjoyed by the casual reader as sort of an organic development in the novel, but for the close reader of Dante, they will again say, I wonder if this Miss Caravan character is actually an embodiment of a poetical observation or condemnation of Dante. And we also have allegories that work in something of perhaps a more comical way, whereas William acknowledges throughout the day and night of chaos and hell that there are flakes of fire, but it's really nothing more than cigarette ash. So there is a river below as well, and he is trapped within what I refer to as a familial Ouroboros. And this destruction of dreams leads him to self-reflection. This is the beginning, almost the puncturing of, let's say, or the opening of the window of the mind a little bit. And he begins to look inward as the external is absolutely collapsing around him. And so, kind of nearing toward the end of just the few things I'll gloss here, we have a reference again to Inferno 103 to 106 in my book. But whereas there's an old man with a head of fine gold referenced by Dante, in my book, it might be made of something else. In the canto, we read, then he declared, the time has come to quit this wood. See that you follow close behind me. These margins form a path that does not scorch, and over them, all flaming vapor is quenched. This is precisely, now this could be obviously interpreted and read in many different ways, and there are many translations of that. But with the traumatizing chaos, it adds another development to William's understanding of the other that will essentially guide his entire role to self-discovery, as it were. As the book is a Künstlerroman, a subdivision of the Bildungsroman, which would be, sort of coming of age novel on the one hand, then for me, it's the artist novel that I'm working with. So there are, in the Wood of Sorrow, that is another recurring theme throughout the book. The wood of sorrow that surrounds this tragic house, that, not unlike the pilgrim's confusion with Leith in putting all of his eggs into the trivium, as it were, with a hatred for the evils of the modern world. William tries desperately to, almost out of love, to get Helena to see clearly these hellish evils. And as we find, that is much easier said than done. So kind of wrapping up towards the end, the emotional chaos of early stages of my book, and really looking at some of the other things that are going on in this chapter that correlates to Inferno 14. Anyone familiar with Polybius and what he says in his 6th book about, of course, we always, if anyone says eternal returns, Nietzsche is generally the first thing that comes up. But I would say in terms of history and a Christological dimension to it, the encounters that William has in some of the interior dialogue lead to the sense of overlapping in the chapters, where, for instance, here's a brief bit of dialogue that after all of this chaos in the next chapter, Helena says this to William: I had a dream that my right foot was made of baked clay, and that I was forced to listen to sticks, silver, gold, brass. an island in the midst of the river. But there are demons beyond the rocks of cavern, as sure as Alexander was Aristotle's pupil, and the demons may inhabit the island too. There are no ideas there in those countless storefronts, but only mythological ornamentation, and thereby ornamental mythologies. So while we don't have Zeus or Jove appear necessarily anywhere in my book as present gods or anything like that, this unfolding reality of hell, I think for Dante and William, classic letters cannot immediately save them. Classic literature cannot save them alone, but perhaps guided by the transformation and moving from the muses into the Holy Spirit, in time, this makes both little and perfectly horrifying sense of what will really have to be sacrificed in order to get to the angels, in order to get away from the caravans of the world and the world of this chapter, just as the characters or the people and the things going on in Inferno 14 are heading in a direction and coming from a very particular place. To conclude, the careful reader will enjoy classical references and further allusions, I think, packed into every single chapter. There's a lot of forthcoming media. Rafa had mentioned Aeschylus. That is a huge role, a huge presence, I think, very subtle, but nonetheless, probably rather than any contemporary artist, someone like Aeschylus has influenced me more. Jerusalem is itself has quite a bit in common with Thebes. And I ultimately believe it's a vindication of classical literature, Western poetics, and civilization, and a creative retrieval in epic form that, like Dante, seeks to remind an age that considers itself free from the burden of self-responsibility, saying, I can recognize what is empirically wrong or what I consider wrong, but what actually what hand do I have in this? Because I'm certainly not free from it. Self-responsibility that without it does condemn one to hell in time, be it now or later. Okay, so to conclude that gloss and pretty much everything, we have the synthesis again, classical thought, Inferno 14, and a contemporary turn, perhaps made by a literary scholar, into a new poetical realm of discourse. I think that I would say lastly that if someone that might fear the classics are on their way out, or that American literary culture has been demolished by social media, video streaming, and other things, fill in the blank, I think Dante and myself and Virgil and a whole host of us, I hope, would suggest that an imperceptible amount of good actually comes out of strife. And for strife forces us to really re-examine the fragility of consciousness and literary discourse across the ages therein. And that's all I've got, and I'll conclude there.
Great, thanks so much, Joseph. Yeah, that was an incredible analysis. I hope everybody, and not only myself, finds it insightful. And I'm sure we're all looking forward to reading your wonderful book. I just wanted to add very quickly that the respect for the classics that Canto 14 is trying to transmit should not only encourage us to read them, but also to write new ones, just as you've done. Just as you've shown, Joseph, if we want to preserve the classics, it is not enough to simply read them and kind of resurrect them, but also to continue the conversation. We need to wrestle with the same existential questions and move by, the proper intellectual self-esteem, try to create new classics. We need to keep these literary tradition alive. We need to learn from the past vestiges and blaze a new trail in the journey ahead of us, the journey of humanity towards beauty, truth, and goodness in the end. And that's all. Thanks so much for watching.